Uh, Hello, my name is Granville Caldwell Jr. I've been teaching since 1999. I'm beginning my 17th year of being a high school teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina. I began in Detroit, Michigan, taught for 6 years there, and I've been here in the Charlotte area for 11 years. This year, as I said, I'm teaching 11th grade or junior English, American literature, every day, all day. I also self-publish, so I encourage students to get their voice out there to, whatever it is. We have a lot of young people that love spoken word, so I encourage them to have their voices heard literally, but also in print too.
How many books have you published?
I've self-published three books. The first one was a book of poetry entitled Footsteps in the Rearview. My second book was Thoughts and Lamentations of Urban Education. I co-authored that with my best friend. That was a book that got me in trouble with my administrators because it gave a very accurate depiction of what urban children go through on a daily basis. And the last book was Peace in the Midst of Mess, and that's semi-autobiographical.
So, what kind of trouble did you get into if you was if you was educating in the field of education?
The truth hurts, and people like to keep, you know the thing about dirty laundry. People don't want to air it, and so when I depict a shameful condition that's going on with our kids in our schools, that's kind of like crossing the line. People don't want their teachers saying that we don't have this, we don't have that. Students are being mistreated, teachers are being mistreated, and so when you produce a book that kind of sheds light on those dirty little secrets, interesting things happen to you. And ever since that book came out, it's just been a very interesting teaching career here in Charlotte.
Wow, how long ago did the book come out, and what did they do to you, or what did they say?
Well, the book came out in 2008, and I was fortunate enough to have the front page of the Charlotte Observer give me just Ryan and I just total press on the book, and we had 2 to 4 radio interviews, and we had a book signing, and all that attention for the last part of the year was on wow, what's going on not just at this school but all the schools in this district. And I had an interesting reactions from my administrators. I was in their doghouse. There's never an official declaration that you
Right.
are now in the doghouse, but I noticed there was increased scrutiny on me, my teaching style. If I didn't have a T crossed or I dotted, I had consequences, stuff like that. So there were moments where my life as a teacher was definitely made a little less easy once the book came out.
What are some of the things that you teach? Some of the books that you have students to read, and so on.
This year, my students, the focus novel will be The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Last year, the focus was Go Tell on the Mountain, and previous to that, I believe it was Fahrenheit 451.
What are some of the things that you see as far as high school English students about their reading levels or literacy levels?
It's a mixed bag right now. You have students who can read, which is fine, but their comprehension level is the challenge. You can read a menu, but you may not understand what you're ordering. And we have students who can read the words, but they're unable to attach deeper meaning and critical thinking to what they've just read. I think that's the most prevalent challenge for me as an English teacher.
What strategies do you use in order to combat that, and what can parents do?
Well, to combat that, I add meaning. I have to use metaphors. I'm a metaphorical teacher, so students tend to understand once I introduce a visual model that they can readily understand. So if I'm discussing external conflict versus internal conflict, it's a fight. One of the things that we're working on this year, of course, is empathy, and that's one reason why I chose The Color Purple, because I want people to see characters that should be able to, elicit empathy from them, like Celie and the other women in The Color Purple. So I just introduce visual examples and try and attach meaning of those to the words that they're reading. Parents can do the same at home. I'm not against technology, but I suggest that parents use technology for good instead of evil. Get audiobooks. Make sure their child has audiobooks, and make sure that they read more than just text and post on the Facebook. Have them read electronic media as well as regular print media.
Can you explain to parents what you mean about using technology for evil?
Well, the same smartphone can be used for dumb things, and we don't want students to understand how to cheat on a test using a smartphone or Apple Watch. We don't want students to be sexting. We don't want students to be bullying other people in online communities. We want students to use those tools for what they can be used as tools of research and tools of communication on a variety of levels. The same phone you can use to send a text to your best friend is the same smartphone that you'll send a text to your boss regarding a due date, regarding a deadline, regarding a project you're working on. So if parents can just remind students that it's nice to take pictures, but it's also equally important to understand how to attach files and use that phone for good instead of evil, as I always say. That's half the battle right there.
What other literature do you use in order to equate feelings with with the kids' experience?
Well, one of the challenges of being a 11th grade teacher is that your focus is American literature. And most American literature anthologies may have the typical or the standard fare of African American writers. Your Frederick Douglass, your Harlem Renaissance guys, and so forth. The school I'm teaching at is 85% white. And so many of the basic writers are outside of their schema, outside of their frame of reference. So what I want to do is, first of all, just introduce anything African American that they may not know. That's where Du Bois comes in. That's where Alice Walker comes in. That's where Raisin in the Sun comes in. And so when I introduce a character like James Baldwin, we could look at Giovanni's Room and look at empathy for someone who's guilty because he's a homosexual and he can't come out as a homosexual. We look at the A-man corner. We look at the central figure being a black woman who's a minister at her church, and we look at the dynamics of a double life. So when you continue to just analyze characters first, and then, oh, by the way, they're black characters. If we remove the stigma as something being a color first as opposed to a person first, that's the biggest thing. So once kids understand that we are talking about human beings who are black, and because they are black, they're going through these situations a little differently than they are, that's my biggest challenge. I think I'm pretty successful with that. So I just use a variety of literature. Alice Walker this year. Haven't thought about what I'm going to use next year, but definitely Alice Walker is the book this year.
Have you ever considered using Lil Wayne or Drake or Tupac?
I do, but it's a double-edged sword because, oddly enough, they're really adept at those guys already. They understand Lil Wayne, and if it begins with little or young, they know more about it than I do. What I want to do is expand their consciousness. I want them to see that yes, Lil Wayne or today's rappers, they can be delivering messages of consciousness too, but they're not the only avenue for that. And I want my students to have just total literacy. So I want them to understand Langston Hughes as much as they will understand Lil Wayne. And so the challenge is not crossing the bridge and making a connection between Lil Wayne and today. That's an easy connection because most of them see that in my encounters with them. But because they're 2015 and 2013, kids see the relevancy. We have children that don't see the relevancy of Tupac or Biggie, and those guys are just 20 years removed from the scene. So when I introduce Tupac's Dear Mama, or when I introduce Biggie with the suicide phone call, that reconnects them. But man, even that's a challenge because we have kids whose frame of references are so condensed, their time frame only goes back 5, maybe 10 years.
Right. So that's why I believe, and tell me if I'm wrong because I'm not an English professor. That's why I think using the bridge from Lil Wayne to Shakespeare, when you break it down and the proses and the similes and the metaphors, right? You can kind of bridge that gap, and then you can teach the pedagogy in hip hop of what was going on in that time period, in that culture, and their frame of reference is expanded across that wrong. I just think that it's tough because just like you said, kids have tough time remembering back Biggie and Tupac, which was just 20 years ago.
I get that question every year. We have to do Shakespeare. Even for our juniors, we have to do Shakespeare. And my choice of Shakespeare, of course, is Othello. And Othello introduces or reminds us of the whole racial dynamics. You have a black man who married a white woman. And so the dynamics that we feel today aren't so 21st century. They were 15th century, they were 14th century. And so Shakespeare points out how even then a Moor or a black man had issues when he was very successful and when he married a white woman. As long as he was successful and single, it was no problem. People loved him, people revered him. But once he married Desdemona, his life was changed. So I could easily make that connection from Shakespeare 400 years ago to what kids are going through now, whenever there's a racial dynamic that's based on interracial marriages or interracial dating. Another example is once I tell kids that Shakespeare introduced a lot of words that they use every day but just don't know that they use, that's another form of connection. For example, Shakespeare introduced the word swagger. And so we have kids talking about swag this, swag that. I point out that they're using a term that Shakespeare invented. And so that emphasizes his relevancy then and his relevancy today.
Do you think, in your professional opinion, that we have a lack of great writers to where we have to dig back so far to even you mentioned Toni Morrison, right? You know, that was a while back. Where are all the writers now to where you can use a point of reference of somebody current?
I think they're out there, but they're really stifled by more common pulp fiction, if I can say that. There are a lot of cats who are uh, as poetic, as deep, as meaningful, but they're not nearly as marketable as what sells. I remember Zane about 10, 15 years ago. Zane was just coming out of everybody's mouth. Uh, but who was the equal and opposite non-Zane at that time? We fumbled to remember who was another contemporary writer at that time. Um, Sometimes, and I think we tend to marginalize. We place the importance of what is important today and what is important. When I say we, I say parents. My son went through his library and we were purging books, and he kept some contemporary books. He kept Wimpy Diary and all that stuff, but I made sure that he kept some classics. He kept Tale of Two Cities. He kept David Copperfield. He kept Treasure Island. He kept Frankenstein. So he's going to continue making that connection between what is great literature today and what was great literature then. I think another example of the difference is the timelessness of the themes being expressed in the text. You know, people don't want to hear about certain things. They want to hear about get rich or die trying. And so that's another thing that we have to combat. Any literature that deals with uh, uh, what we call dystopias, when we have like the Hunger Game trilogy and you have the Divergent series, they're really fascinated with uh, dystopias, which is great, but I want them to make the connection between the classic dystopian literatures like Fahrenheit 451 in 1984 and Brave New World. And once they're able to make that deeper, timeless connection, they can make better choices for themselves and their kids in the future. Everything that's current isn't necessarily the best thing for kids.
Exactly, especially in a society that thrives off of making money, and is not education is not the number one thing. So, as an English professor, how much should a parent make their child read?
They stress a minimum of at least 30 minutes a day. I suggest an hour. And I suggest that a student finishes a book, any particular book of their interest, at least once a week. When you examine CEOs of our top Fortune 500 companies, they average reading a book a week. And so reading is power, knowledge is power. So I encourage my kids to read as much and complete as much as possible, because those who make money and those who become business owners, they know that their power, their investment in literature is indirectly an investment in their career as a business owner. And I point this out to students the first week of class. The more you read, the more marketable you'll be in the future, and the more marketable you become yourself individually. So I would say at least an hour a day of serious challenging reading. And they can read fluff stuff all they want, but they need to just read literature that forces them to think about themselves and think about others. And that doesn't come from People's Magazine. That can only come from literature that challenges you as a person and an individual.
Right, but before they make it to that point of reading challenging information, they have to. Well, we first have to get our kids acclimated to reading and like reading, because like you said, we live in a technology era to where it's easy to get on a blog or flip through your phone or your iPad. There's so many other things to do than to pick up a book, right? So, how do parents get their kids to actually love reading or even like reading?
Well, you model it in front of them. You read in front of them. You take them to the library. My son, for example, over the summer, we would take him to the library 2 or 3 times a month. During the school year, we would schedule at least one trip to the library for reading-based activities. But when I'm at home, my son sees me reading a book. He sees me reading a newspaper. He sees his mom reading, and not just online, not just from a tablet, but actually reading from a book, and not being afraid to ask questions about the characters. Um, G3 just finished Holes a couple of weeks ago by Louis Sachar. And so I was asking him questions about X-Ray and Zero and Stanley Yelnats. So that conversation about a book that we both read reemphasizes the importance of reading. Reading connects people. And so if parents just read, like so many things, what parents do, kids would do. So if parents show kids daily the importance of reading, that'll just transfer to the kids.
What is your advice to a mother or father, single mother or father working two jobs who, to support the kids and they don't have the luxury of time to read in front of them because they're at work majority of the time? What advice can you give about how to still enforce that reading theory?
Well, if you're not around for the kid to read, provide incentives for them to read. Say, whenever you finish a book and give me a little reading log on this book that you've read, I have an incentive for you. So that incentive might be a trip to McDonald's. That incentive might be a Wii game. That incentive might be an upgrade on their phone. So once you know what's important to your kid to use as motivation and as an incentive, you could kind of work around that. So even though they may not be there to watch their kid read, uh, they can say, hey, show me the reading log on the book that you read this week. And, they may not have time to read in front of them, but certainly they should have time to discuss their kids' education with them. And that could be a 5 or 10 minute conversation. Show me what you read. Tell me what you've learned about it. Have you made a connection to any of the characters in the book? And that could be something that's once a week. And then eventually you get to a point where that child is self-motivated to do that and show that. That child takes over ownership of his or hers own literacy. And they'll take over and they'll begin to interrogate the mom. Okay, I need some more books. Do you have any more books to suggest? Because, now my incentive is to get the car for the weekend, or my incentive is to get this new outfit. So if you attach an incentive initially to reading, make it a benefit as opposed to detriment, kids will take over eventually. I think my kids have been around books. I can't recall, let's say my child started reading at 2 and 1/2. All I can say is that I've always had books around my child and my children. And even if they were just curious about picking up a book and flipping the pages and not being able to read, they knew what a book was. They knew that it was something that daddy liked and daddy valued and mommy valued. So by them seeing us with these things on a very basic level, they knew that it was a good thing. And then eventually, when they were able to talk and start preschool, 4 years old and 5 years old, then they were able to just begin picking up learning more and more reading. Tam studied with our kids, teaching them the basic words and, how to write your name and stuff like that. But it's always been part of the atmosphere, and they just kind of tuned in at different levels based on their maturity. Another thing that's been a huge help is, my wife is a stay-at-home mom. So, God is good. We had the luxury of her being a teacher for all of our kids, by being a stay-at-home mom. That was a personal decision that we made that, I would go to work and she would be the mommy and the teacher. So our kids benefited from that.
Okay, do you assign outside readings for your students to read on their own? Not for a grade per se, but I should say suggested readings. Like, hey, you're a great reader. If you're interested in this, you should read this. And if so, what books do you offer?
It depends on the class. For my standards, it's not so much offering them books, but I offer them attachments to certain articles, shorter text, because when we hear the word literacy, it's more than just books. It's print media, it's video media, it's audio media. So it may be listening to an interview, or maybe reading a newspaper article, or maybe examining a work of art. And so I may, for example, have a homework assignment. I want you to look at the Mona Lisa and study it and just write down 5 observations. And even though they're looking at a work of art, they're analyzing text. It just so happens to be visual text. So they should be able to see how color affects the tone of a piece, or how lighting brings out this, or how shape and how proportion delivers Da Vinci's purpose as a painter. I know last year there were a variety of movie assignments. I had students compare 2 different types of movies. We read Othello, they watched O, and then they watched a traditional presentation of Othello, the one starring, I think, Laurence Olivier. And so a simple assignment was to watch both of those, write down the things they have in common, and write down the things that they don't have in common. And then we discuss these things in class. So when I assign reading assignments, the assignments may be visually read something or auditorily read something, but you're still analyzing things, because I still want them to attach meaning to whatever it is they're looking at, whatever it is they're listening to, and whatever it is they're reading.
Yeah, because I think it's important that because kids watch a lot of TV. I think the last study I read was, which is an old study now, 2012, it said that African Americans watch more TV than any other race. But yet a lot of us misunderstand the symbolism in what we are watching, right? I.e., the propagandaism in the commercials when they trying to get you to buy this or buy that, right? They brainwash our children into thinking they need something, but it's actually a want. And then the children ask the parents, and the parents, if they can afford it, usually buy into it. So, right? So, do you ever attack that monster as far as getting them to just speak about the commercials? Some of the commercials they watch are shows they watch, and the symbolism of it, and the meanings that are the messages that they are conveying.
All the time. Some of my former students tell me, Mr. Caldwell, you have ruined the Proud Family for me forever. Or Mr. Caldwell, you have ruined Good Times for me forever, because I point out these racial archetypes that are perpetuated in shows. For example, how lighter skinned blacks are more favored than darker skinned blacks. And you see these things in TV shows, and you see these things in movies, and you even see these things in cartoons. We see how men are emasculated in television and in film and in shows. So there's a lot of things that are going on. And that's the important thing about media literacy, because you may be able to detect these things in a book, but the same thing will be going on right in front of you on a television show, and you don't even realize that. So where I come in, I point these things down in political ads. I point these things out in commercials. I point these things out in cartoons. I point these things out in movies. And I point these things out in books. And once students start seeing these things, once I start unplugging them from the matrix, that lets me know I'm getting to them. And that's my job as a teacher, to teach English, but to also create and foment critical thinking.
Create that consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, what advice would you offer parents?
Parents, you're the second most important aspect in your child's education, with the first aspect being the child itself. I mean, you're there at ground zero. You have to make sure that students are staying on top of their responsibilities. You have to confront the schools. You have to confront the teachers. You have to demand and be sure that they are actually giving your child the education that he or she deserves and needs. So take full ownership over your child's education. As Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. Trust that your child is being taught, but verify that that child is also being taught. So don't be afraid. Make time. If you can't come, send an auntie. Make sure that your kids are being taught by qualified teachers. But understand that teachers are not your enemies. We're your friends. We want to help your child become the best your child can be. So be more And this isn't for all parents, but the parents who are not diligent in their child's education, just become more of a busybody and not just a spectator in your child's education. And demand excellence from your children. You know, if you demand excellence, they'll rise to to the level of expectations that you put for them. So if you expect greatness, you'll get greatness, and if you expect mediocrity, you'll get mediocrity.